Senator Elizabeth Warren has finally released her plan on Medicare for all. So now there's a lot of details to this, so this is going to take a while. But let me just address some of the most obvious questions here for progressives, for myself as well. Is this a truly single player plan, or is it a public option like Buttigieg? And is Elizabeth Warren basically, is she going to fight for it? Is she genuine? Right. So now I actually do believe that she's genuine on this. And look, to be fair, I wasn't exactly sure until I read the details. That said, there's a couple of red flags on here that I'm going to talk about as well. But I do think that this is a very, I should say, very detail oriented piece of legislation. So let's dive into it, right? So now it appears already that Bernie Sanders is, or that Elizabeth Warren has modeled her plan after Senator Bernie Sanders. Now, would it actually be better if she decided to throw her full support behind Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan? In my opinion, yes. Just say, look, if I get elected, I'm going to enact his plan. But of course, it is a political campaign, and so I don't know if she would. I mean, I don't know if any politician would actually do that. So this is, of course, Elizabeth Warren being a politician. Nonetheless, her plan is essentially almost identical. The only difference is, of course, is how they pay for it, which varies definitely from Bernie Sanders. So now let's get into first how she cuts costs, right? So now the Warren plan, like of course Medicare for All, would reduce administrative spending. She says it would do it from about 12% of premiums currently collected, as with private insurance. She would reduce those administrative costs to about 2.3%, which is, of course, Medicare's expense already. So, Medicare, how would you do that? Again, because you just reduce it to Medicare rates. You would eliminate private insurance. So now that actually saves a lot of money, about $1.8 trillion. The second thing they would do is go after high provider prices. The plan calls for reimbursing physicians and outpatient providers at current Medicare rates, while reimbursing hospitals at 110% Medicare rates. Okay. Rural and teaching hospitals would get higher reimbursements, and all providers would benefit from simpler administrative processes, lower drug prices, more patients with insurance, and the lifting of uncompensated care. So, look, a lot of this discussion is going to be about what money is saved and how she's going to bring these costs down. Because, again, her plan is essentially basically lifted from Bernie Sanders, okay, on what it covers, right? So now all of that, of course, requires the government to be the main insurer, sole provider, essentially sole provider of insurance, and of course have power to set reimbursement rates that doctors are actually going to follow. The problem with our current system, of course, is that private insurance, uh, if you have a system with both private and public insurance, and private insurance holds a large market share, then you're going to have doctors that are just going to refuse to take Medicare reimbursement rates. That's the problem that we have now. That's why there are people that even they have Medicare or Medicaid, for example, they can't go to any doctor because there are doctors out there that won't accept patients. But if you have the government as the main insurer, well, then of course they don't really have anywhere else to go, and they're going to have to take those Medicare rates, right? So that's really important, right? And the only way that this is going to work is if there's a very, very limited role for private insurance. Okay. So now, in addition, Warren proposes ending the practice where hospitals will charge for different rates of same treatment, cutting overpayments for rehabilitation, palliative care, and expanding bundled payments that cut down on fee for service medicine. All the provider related savings save a lot of money, about $2.9 trillion. Dollars. On prescription drugs, she actually has a great plan. Warren promises to reduce brand name drug prices by 70% and generic drug prices by about 30%. Now, how's she going to do that? By allowing the government to negotiate all purchases of pharmaceuticals. So the government will be able to negotiate for Medicare, which will be the primary insurance. So now she would set about a ceiling of 110% of an international index as the highest possible price. Now, she has a plan for if the negotiations with drug companies fail. And I love this, right? The plan calls for if negotiations fail, seizing pharmaceutical patents and licensing them to competitors, or having the government manufacture them directly. Oh, you're not going to play ball? Oh, okay. So we're going to try to negotiate to get your costs, get your prices down to a reasonable level, right? Because we're not going to allow you to overcharge 700%, right? No, we're going to have you bring it down to a reasonable price so you can make a little bit of money, a little bit of profit, but not gouge us or gouge the American people. We're going to bring that down by 70%. And if you're not going to play ball, we're just going to take your patent. That's it. We're going to take your patent. We're going to give it to your competitors so that you can't sit there and price fix, right, by yourself. Now, how that would affect collusion in that, again, you would have the government being the main negotiator and having the main power. So they would be the main purchaser of these drugs, which is how they do it in all these other countries. So that would cut down on the collusion, right? So great, wonderful. Now, that, of course, is expected to save about $1.7 trillion. Altogether, it's a $52 trillion plan over the next 10 years. So now you think, oh my God, that's holy crap. But again, we're on track to spend that over the next 10 years anyway. And of course, she has to raise an additional $20 trillion in taxes, and she does it in various ways. One of them is literally cutting military spending. So I think it was there's a particular military fund that she cuts by about $800 million. That money does not go to the troops. It basically is a way for the Pentagon to try to get even more money, even if they don't actually need it. So there you go. That's one way. Other ways would come from an employer head tax. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail as well. Why that might not be a good idea, but also additional taxes on large corporations, banks, investors, and the wealthy. Now, the head tax, like I said, might not be a great idea, at least when you compare it to Bernie Sanders' plan, which has a general Medicare tax, right? That's a Medicare payroll tax, which is what we currently pay already. So now that head tax would apply to firms with 50 or more employees. Now, according to Warren, part-time employees would count towards that total, along with those workers seen as independent contractors. So, for example, I'm an independent contractor, so with the Young Turks. So now Young Turks, I would count as, in this case, as an employee, right, towards that head count. So now small businesses under 50 employees, however, would be exempt from that head count unless they're providing healthcare today already. So if the company has 36 employees and they provide healthcare, well, then the head tax would be applied to them. Okay. Pass-through businesses like law firms and private equity would also end up having to pay that head tax. Okay. So now she says, Warren does, that there will be no middle-class tax increases. I think she's being disingenuous about that. And there's a reason, of course. And that's basically her political messaging, right? So she said over and over on the debate stage, we're going to not increase taxes on the middle class. There will be no middle class tax increases. That's not necessarily true. In fact, you're going to end up having some middle class tax increases to pay for that additional $20 trillion. That said, Medicare for All, the beauty of it is that while you will have a tax increase that is fairly small, it will be dwarfed by the savings of no longer having to pay copays, deductibles, and any sort of out-of-pocket expense. Not only that, but drug prescription drug prices will actually be smaller, and you will have less overhead expenses from administrative costs. That's going to save money. That's going to require less in taxation. And in fact, Medicare for All plans, for example, Bernie Sanders' plan, 95% of people will not see a tax increase, but you will see that 5% corporations, the wealthy, pay more in taxes to finance this. Okay, so now, like I said, according to her team, and this is talking about tax cuts, and again, this is going by her estimates, right? Apparently, this would be an $11 trillion over the next 10 years tax cut for American families. So, okay, now that's interesting. Now, part of that, and here's the other thing, right? So now, in her plan, individuals will still pay the current Medicare tax, right? There would still be a Medicare payroll tax, but it would be exempt for certain individuals, right? And I'll get into the details on that and why the head tax is actually a bit problematic, right? And might actually not work and work against the bill. But now, first, whatever taxes fund the state share of healthcare programs, people will still pay through their taxes, right? But premiums and copays, of course, would be gone. Now, her bill ties in with comprehensive immigration reform, which is expected to save money, banking regulation initiatives that would save money, antitrust enforcement, although how much money from that is saved from that is not detailed in the bill, boosts unionization, tax compliance, anti-corruption, and of course, like I said, the military cuts or the military spending cuts. So now, one provision that I do like about this is employees operating under collective bargaining would actually have their tax reduced if they pass any savings under that to workers in wages or benefits, right? So it's one way to encourage unionization. I like that. So now, I was concerned that there was going to be a larger role for private insurance, but it appears so far there doesn't seem to be. But I'm also concerned that she's not being forthright and honest about middle class taxes, right? But her plans it does seem to be single payer. So that's good. But there's a nitpick, right? And of course, there's some obvious problems. And one of them is the lack of a phase in period. So now Bernie Sanders, he says, we're going to phase this in 4 years. Elizabeth Warren says long term goal. In fact, she says long term goal about 4 different times. So look, progressives rightly point to it and say, wait a minute, give us a number. If it's going to be, and the reason that's important, right? So if it's going to be 4 years, we know to expect it in 4 years, right? We know who's going to get what. We know who's going to get covered within that transition period. With Warren, we don't know. And I remember with Kamala Harris's plan, she said, well, we're going to have a phase in of 10 years. Well, if you have a phase in of 10 years, you might as well not have a plan because it's not going to work. Republicans are going to take that time. Republican president gets into office, for example, during the phase-in period, they're going to scrap the whole thing. So that's a big, big problem, right? And so, look, Warren's plan, Warren, you got to come out and you got to have a phase-in period. We need to know the details on that. And for somebody who's so detail-oriented, for someone who has a plan for that, I get a little worried that we don't have enough information on that plan. All right. So now, then we have the head tax, right? So Medicare taxes, Medicare payroll taxes are much better than head taxes. Head taxes are a problem. Here's why. Now, the Medicare head tax would actually be a flat tax. It would be a regressive tax. And so it would end up charging people more, right? And they would pass that cost down to the actual employees. And so you would have small businesses that would actually end up paying more if they're over 50 employees. Now, the other issue here is that you have independent contractors and the companies who hire them, they will be exempt from Medicare contribution taxes or the payroll tax, both initially and forever, along with the companies under 50 employees. Now, the problem with that is that companies can use this to game the system. Why? They will make their workers independent contractors or spin them off into different firms with less than 50 employees. Why? So the company can continue to avoid paying the Medicare taxes and only pay the head tax. And that's it. Well, that's not good. That's not good for funding, especially when you have $20 trillion to make up in order to have this properly funded. Now, the result here is that the average Medicare employee contribution would have to go up in order to make revenue or keep revenue stable. So that would actually mean increasing taxes on people who pay that payroll tax, which would be you guys, be us. We would pay more taxes. So it is a middle class tax increase. The rich will end up paying less through the head tax, the employers will, and we will pay more in order to keep it solvent. So now, a payroll tax, by the way, if you fund it through, like, for example, what Bernie Sanders says, you're going to have a tax increase through the payroll tax. These companies will not be able to game that system. And so there it is, right? So look, her major change from Bernie is political, right? So basically she says, I'm not going to raise taxes in the middle class in order to try to get a leg up on Bernie because she's a politician and she knows that middle class tax increases are not politically popular. Bernie Sanders has the balls to come out and say there will be a tax increase, but again, as it's been shown, we will actually save money. You will save money. You will pay a little bit more in taxes, but you will save money from the lack of a copay, premium, or deductible, or any other kind of out-of-pocket costs. Those will be gone. You will save money. Bernie Sanders is being honest, whereas Elizabeth Warren is playing tricky word games. And so that's really important, right, to point out. As much as I do like this policy proposal, there are problems in it, and there are problems with Elizabeth Warren and whether or not you can trust her. Because, again, she's being dishonest in this piece of legislation on how exactly she's going to pay for it, as well as the taxes that could go up on the middle class. And so it's really, really important, right? Again, this is why we like Bernie Sanders. This is why, look, and I'm trying to be incredibly fair. Again, this is a great piece of legislation. It is Medicare for all. It is single payer, but there are some glaring issues, and so we got to keep it 100. Bernie Sanders is honest about this, so there is the breakdown, right? And so far, again, there's a lot that she needs to go and clarify and look at and see if she can improve it. But I'll say this. I'm actually glad that we can have this conversation and that we can do these policy breakdowns. And basically the only difference here is how we're going to pay for something that I think is way overdue in this country. And that's to guarantee health care to every single man, woman, and child in this country. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a patreon.com/TYTNation set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know how I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent progressive media.